Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Iowa College AmeriCorps Program 2018 Financial Training Webinar. Some things we're going to go over today are the benefits that members can expect and you as a host site can expect from this program, some of the policies and procedures that help to guide the program, ways that you can obtain that match obligation, other policies around match and that are unique to match, as well as procedures like documentation that you can submit. And then finally, we're just going to wrap up with deadlines for the financial aspect of this program. So what are some of the benefits that you can expect from this program? So these are the things that are listed in your host site agreement. So for members or for host sites, you can expect Iowa Civic Action Academy travel assistance. So you can either do this as a host site or we can do this work individually with members. Ideally, what we want to do is be able to work with host sites as often as possible, and especially if you are getting a group of students together and we can directly support their travel to and from the Iowa Civic Action Academy. And so you can request travel assistance for that group of AmeriCorps members traveling to that event. So this year we don't have a cap on what a host site or individual members can request, but we do have an overall cap for the program. And so you can request funding out of that pool to support that travel for that. We do allocate professional development fundings to the host site. So there's $75 per part-time member is allocated to the host site that you can use and distribute to one member, a group of members, whoever you really want to use those professional development funds to support the development of your AmeriCorps members and their continual improvement. There's also day of service funding available, so up to $2,000 for day of service projects. Your AmeriCorps members have to be involved in that in some way. They can help to plan those events. They can serve as volunteer recruiters and managers. They can simply attend the events, something like along those lines. Obviously, your AmeriCorps members have to be tied in some way. We do let you dictate how that is, but they just have to be participating in some capacity. Then lastly, there's a little bit of funding that you can provide for recognition if there's something that you want to do in that area to recognize the service of your members. The use of the benefits, so just thinking about when you can use them, how to use them. We'll talk a little bit more about how to use them a little later on, especially within the idea of allowability, but use of benefits. So for the Civic Action Academy, who can use those or when can you apply those? So if you have a member that's enrolled prior to November 9th or 10th of 2018 who can actually attend the event, then certainly you can use funding available, travel funding for their ability to travel to that event. For professional development, you earn those dollars for each member that's enrolled into your program. So if you requested 5 positions and you were only able to recruit 3 of those, then 3 times 75, whatever that is, that's what's available to you for professional development funding to support the development of those members. On day of service, that $2,000, that's the maximum rate, and that's applicable through the end of your host site agreement. And obviously the ICAP members have to be involved in that project in some way. So you do have to have members who are actively serving in order to use those funds. Recognition, that's again similar to professional development that's earned for each member that's enrolled. And lastly, just the use of benefits, it is a use it or lose it situation. So if you don't use the funding, then we use it for other things in the program. We're going to roll that into our summer program and use that for to support that initiative. On the member benefits, for part-time members, actually for both part-time and full-time members, they have pretty comparable benefits on the financial side of things in terms of what you as the host site and they as the member can be expected to work with us on. Certainly full-time members receive things like health insurance and a living allowance, but both receive, again, travel support to go to the Civic Action Academy. They can request travel assistance if it works out. So like if you're a campus where you only have one member that's serving there, certainly the member can request travel assistance from us rather than it going through a big campus group. if it's not appropriate for them doing that. Obviously, both part-time and full-time members do have that scholarship to waive the member's registration fee to attend the Iowa Safety Action Academy. Part-time members, again, have the professional development. Full-time members have a full $1,000 for allowable professional development. So they can use that to attend Iowa Campus Compact events. They can also use that to travel to conferences that might be applicable to the things that they're doing with their service. So there's a wide variety of things that you can do there, and we can work directly with the member to reimburse them. We can also work directly with your campus to reimburse that as well. So use of benefits for members, the benefits accrue for each term of service, and it has to be used during that term of service. So if we have a member who was a full-time member last year, and they're serving as a full-time member this year, they can use that $1,000 for while they're an active member. It doesn't double up into the next year. So if they don't use their $1,000 last year, they don't get $2,000 this year. It's $1,000 while they're an active member. So the same thing is true for our part-time members. So if you have $75, then that doesn't double up in the next one. So it is, and it's also a use it or lose it sort of situation. So in the area of policies, some of the things that we're going to go over, this is kind of the overall guiding idea with federal grants is to understand when purchasing things or applying things to a federal grant are those costs allowable? So we want to talk about what is and what is not allowable for members, for travel, for day of service, those sorts of things. We also have to consider what is reasonable. So we have to understand if the cost is reasonable. So we're going to talk a little about what could be considered reasonable, what could be considered not reasonable. We're going to talk about allocable. So is the cost properly allocated to ICAP? So really the idea here is that ICAP isn't going to pay for more than it's benefiting from. And I'll give some specific examples that make that a little bit more easy to understand. And then lastly, documented is the cost documented. In order for Iowa Campus Compact to receive and to receive funding, to be reimbursed for the costs that we're reimbursing you for, we have to have proper documentation for that. And so we just need to make sure that all the costs are properly documented. And we have some systems and tools in place that help out with that process. So there are some different policies that might vary for what happens with the ICAP costs versus what happens with your source of match. And we will talk about source of match later on in the presentation. But for the side of ICAP, what really guides our policies are Iowa Western's policies, Iowa Campus Compact policies, and obviously AmeriCorps policies. And those really apply to things like member living allowance, professional development funds, day of service, recognition. So any sort of cost where you're asking for to be reimbursed by Iowa Campus Compact, that's when those policies really come into play. For source of match, so if you are providing office space to the member and you want to count that as a source of match, or a housing benefit, or a staff time, those sorts of things, those are really guided by your institution's policies. Those aren't something that Iowa Western Community College is really interested in providing guidance on. Certainly AmeriCorps and the federal statute do have some guiding policies around these areas as well, but it's a little bit less stringent than working on the other things like member living allowance. So what are some allowable purchases? So that was one of the first things that we did talk about is what are some of what's allowable, what's not allowable. And there's a couple of ways that we can look at this. So the first question that we can ask is, does the federal government allow the purchase? There is a list of allowable or unallowable purchases that you can find in the CFR, which is like this guiding document to all federal grants. And there's a specific number right there, 200.420. And you can find just a list of what's allowable broadly and unallowable broadly. Next question that we would ask is, does CNCS allow the purchase? And really this is thinking about things like prohibited activities, what's involved in that. That's kind of one of the guiding things in there. Typically we don't run into that, and more often than not, we fall back on to the federal government broadly. Although there are, with this question, CNCS allow this purchase, CNCS does have some funky ways of interpreting the overall allowable, unallowable purchases. And so that's something that we as an agency, Iowa Campus Compact, have kind of learned by working with the funder to understand what are those nuances. We also have to understand, does Iowa Western Community College allow the purchase? Generally, they do. Theirs are really based off of what the federal government does, and so generally it fits within that as well. And then finally, does ICAP allow the purchase? As in, are we as a program, do we want to invest these funds in that way? So we do have more specific things about that on the program website, and you can certainly look at those. We'll talk a little bit about these things during the presentation. So what is an allowable expense for ICAP? So we do things like member travel, we do supply purchases, as well as fees to host a speaker, trainer, or facilitator. So for member travel, really what we're talking about here is supporting member professional development, such as to and from a training or workshop, maybe meals while they're out traveling to do that, if there are overnight costs that are related to that, and then certainly event registration fees. There may also be travel to complete the service project, and that's kind of tied to that day of service funding. So, and the one thing I'll mention about travel in this area, and I'll talk about this in the next slide too, is that member travel to and from their service site is not allowable. So just as if you as an employee can't get reimbursed to travel to work, members can't be reimbursed to travel to their service site. On the side of supplies, any sort of general training supplies or supplies related to providing a training locally to members. So maybe you might need notebooks for that. Maybe you might need giant Post-it notes for that. Candy for tables could be a thing. Name tags, things like that. Things to complete the training, those certainly would be allowable. And then also supplies to complete the day of service project. And I put not food as in not meals for volunteers or for AmeriCorps members or participants in it. If you're packaging meals, like doing a Meals for the Heartland or Outreach Inc. or something like that, certainly that food does apply and it's allowable. Fees to host a speaker, trainer, or facilitator. That certainly you can bring in a speaker and have your members attend that, and the grant will pay for a portion of that speaker fee. What are some things that are not allowable expenses for this grant? Obviously, costs incurred prior to the award. So if you're asking for reimbursement for things that happened in July, then we certainly can't support those for 2018. But working August through October, I think is the end of our August 2018 through October 2019. Things that occur in that time period certainly would be considered allowable. Anything that violates the prohibited activities that you can find in your host site agreement, we also discuss those in length in the orientation. All personnel costs, including stipends to students, faculty, and staff. So personnel costs have to be directly related to the grant, to the program. And in this case, what we're talking about is using things like that day of service funding to pay for student, faculty, or staff time for the day of service project. So that's not allowable. Travel costs to and from the member's service site, as I mentioned before, that's not allowable. It's kind of commute time. That's just not something that the grant funds can be used for. AmeriCorps member living allowance. So Iowa Campus Compact can pay member living allowances. You as a host site cannot. Our funder wants member living allowance payments to be centralized. And so that's why we do everything through our fiscal host, Iowa Western Community College. They do all of our living allowance disbursements. That way we can ensure that every single AmeriCorps member in this program is receiving the same treatment when it comes to that living allowance benefit. Any sort of shared supplies, copier paper, pens, things that your office needs generally to operate can't be applied or paid for through any of the funds from this program. Entertainment and alcohol. And so that's a pretty broad thing, but what that really means is certainly alcohol, but then really things like meals, rentals, or the example here, tickets to shows or sporting events, those sorts of things are not allowable. So you really have to think about that, especially within the idea of professional development and also on when recognizing member service, is that those things are not allowable. Indirect costs broadly are just not allowable, so any sort of like overhead or administrative support. And then lastly, tuition or scholarships for AmeriCorps members. So you can't use that day of service funding to give as a scholarship to AmeriCorps members, to your ICAP members for serving the program. They're receiving those benefits from the program, so we can't use the funding in addition to that. The next question that was asked was on the line of reasonability. And so when we're talking about reasonability, what we're talking about here is if a cost is reasonable if, in its nature and amount, it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time of the decision. It's a really wordy way of just making sure that nobody here is overpaying for what they're asking to be paid, what they're paying for. So, as an example, when it comes to lodging, we would expect to pay the cheapest rate possible at that particular hotel, and not getting a suite for a single member to stay at a hotel or something like that. If you're getting meals and you're out of town, paying a reasonable amount of money for each meal, so that might be $10 to $20 for a single meal. Here in Des Moines for like a lunch or a dinner, but it certainly wouldn't be $120 for a single meal. Air travel, in this one, if you have a member who is traveling by air, then it would be the lowest cost available, and it wouldn't be first class tickets or something like that. So here, standard or coach class rates would be considered reasonable. In the area of supplies, so general training supplies, those sorts of things, a notebook at a reasonable cost might be $5 for a notebook. At an unreasonable cost would be this $225 notebook that I found. So that would be definitely considered unreasonable. And the same thing goes for any other sorts of supplies. And then lastly, fees to host a speaker, trainer, facilitator. Again, it would just have to be similar to what that speaker would pay, what you would pay that speaker for that sort of training or another speaker facilitator. And really, I think in this one, because this is kind of comparing apples to oranges, it's just making sure that that speaker isn't, they learn that you're using grant funding for their speaker fee, and then all of a sudden their speaker fee doubles. That's what we're trying to avoid. So it's the same fee that they would normally charge. In the area of allocability, or was an allocable purchase, it's really the cost is considered allocable to ICAP if the goods or services involved are chargeable or assignable to ICAP. So it's tied to the grant as closely as we possibly can make it, and it benefits the program in some way, and it is certainly necessary to the overall operation of what you have going on there locally for your ICAP project. So some ways to think about this for an area of member travel. So as an example, a member travels from their host site to an ICAP training, and then the member travels to their parents' house for the weekend. The grant is only going to reimburse the member's travel cost to regional training. We're not going to reimburse the travel to their parents' house or their parents' house back to your campus. So those are the only costs that we're going to cover in that type of scenario. In the area of supplies, so if your campus, let's say, orders a whole bunch of notebooks, and you're going to give some to your ICAP members and then some to other student volunteers, we're only going to reimburse the cost of the notebooks for the ICAP members. You just need to do the math to figure out how much that is. In the area of like a speaker or a trainer facilitator, it's what ICAP is paying for, or how the ICAP members are benefiting from that speaker. Here are two examples of how this might work. So example one, the speaker fee is that $3,000. That speaker provides 3 trainings to your campus. 1 is to your AmeriCorps members, and then 2 are to faculty departments. So ICAP is going to cover $1,000 of that. There's 3 trainings. AmeriCorps is benefiting from 1 of them, so we're going to cover 1/3 of the cost, or $1,000. And the second example here, let's say the speaker has that same $3,000 speaking fee, and they're just providing one speech, doing one event on campus, and it's open to the entire campus. About 25 students come to the speaker. We know that 5 are ICAP members. Maybe you have 5 ICAP members on your campus and you're requiring them to attend. In this case, ICAP is only going to cover $600 of that $3,000. The cost for those members. So 5 out of 25 times 2,000, 20% of that $3,000. That's why we're only covering $600 of that total $3,000. So the rest of that speaker fee has to come from somewhere else and can't be applied to the grant. So when it comes to documenting purchases for things like events, so like for that speaker fee or maybe a day of service event or something like that, what we need on our end in order to receive reimbursement is an event agenda. We do have an agenda template that you can use. You can certainly create your own. You don't have to use this document, but we do need an agenda that has some information on it. It doesn't have to be exhaustive, but we just need to know, when did things start, when did they end, were there breaks in the middle, if there was lunch, did folks take a break during that time? Those sorts of event details are important. And we will certainly work with you to complete this to make sure that it meets the needs of Volunteer Iowa, our funder, and everybody understands what's on there. The other thing that we need for events are a sign-in sheet. And so as an example with that speaker that I mentioned, where 5 of the attendees were ICAP members or AmeriCorps members, and then the other 20 were just students from your campus who weren't AmeriCorps members, we would only expect you to have the sign-in sheets for the AmeriCorps members. You certainly, you can have other folks sign in and then indicate which one's an ICAP member, which one isn't, but we would only expect to see the names of AmeriCorps members on the sign-in sheet, but they would certainly have to do that. There are other ways to think about doing this too. So if you don't want to have, if you're going to have those AmeriCorps members complete a reflection or do some other sort of activity that documents that they attended it, you can certainly use that instead of this sign-in sheet, and we can kind of work with you on those things. But really the intent of this is just to document that the person was there and they were there for the entire time. And I can't underscore this enough, but agenda and sign-in sheets are very important. They're also easy to forget. So if you have members who, or you have situations where you're having events and you want to use that, get funding for those events or want to use it as a source of match, then we really do need sign-in sheets to ensure that everybody attended that event who was an AmeriCorps member. If you're requesting funds from us, whether it's for member travel or it's for supplies or day of service sorts of things, what we really need from you is an invoice. We do have an invoice that you can use on the program website. You can certainly use, and we would encourage you probably more to use, one from your institution. And really what we need from that, certainly is a list of what you're requesting, as well as copies of the documentation supporting it, but then also a little bit about the purpose behind it. So if it's a day of service event, we need some information behind what was the purpose of it, and maybe what was the involvement of the AmeriCorps members in that day of service project. For member travel, the things that we need are to understand the reason for the travel. So it might be to attend a professional development opportunity provided by Iowa Campus Compact. If we might need to reimburse mileage. So if the member is using their personal vehicle, then we need to know the exact mileage that we're reimbursing, as well as the mileage calculation. Obviously, any sort of agenda for the training or conference that they may have attended. If they flew to where they're going, then obviously the airline receipt, any sort of applicable meal receipts, and anything else that might be relevant to them attending whatever event or training or professional development opportunity it is that they're doing. If you're using your internal If you're taking a campus vehicle to Iowa Civic Action Academy as an example, then any sort of documentation that your institution has, we could certainly use, and would be preferable and a lot easier for everybody to work through those processes. So then you just submit whatever documentation your institution might have on the value of that campus car or something like that. We do have a form that you can use, and this is really only for members that are using their private vehicle to travel to and from places. So again, any other sort of travel, so if they're using a campus vehicle or they're flying or something like that, then they should use whatever comes out of your institution. You should submit that to us for reimbursement. On the sides of supplies, what we need on the sides of supplies are really just things like receipts, itemized receipts. They do have to be itemized. We have to know exactly what was being paid for. And we do need to understand what was the purpose behind them. So if you're asking for a bunch of notebooks, I can't just reimburse notebooks without understanding, how were they involved with the AmeriCorps program in some capacity. And that can be done through email. That can be listed on the invoice. If we don't see it on the invoice or have someplace where we can notice it, then we will follow up with you to make sure that we have that documented someplace. For speaker fees, really what we need is that contract or that agreement, a copy of that. And if AmeriCorps is only paying for a portion of that, then we need to understand what that portion is and how was that portion determined. So again, it could just be as easy as doing the math of saying they did 3 trainings. One was with AmeriCorps members, and so ICAP is paying for $1,000. On the side of match, the same sort of 4 questions do apply in terms of what is and is not allowable, what is reasonable, what is allocable, and then making sure that everything is documented. The guiding policies, again, on the side of match, really are going to be more on the side of your institution, although the federal statute does come into play broadly for these sorts of things because this is a federal grant. On the side of allowable, the things that we're kind of concerned about are, does the federal government allow the purchase? Does CNCS allow the purchase? And then does your institution allow the purchase? So your internal financial policies. So we're not thinking about things like Iowa Western's policies. How does that play into this? So on the side of personnel and benefits, what is allowable and what is allocable? Certainly anything, any sort of cost to supervise members would be allowable and allocable. If you wanted to use supervisor travel to conduct site visits, so whatever your institution's policy is around that, if that is something that is reimbursable, then certainly that could be something that could be used as a source of match for this program. Supply purchases related to program outcomes, so perhaps for a day of service project, you're purchasing supplies, and ICAP members are involved in that day of service project, those costs could be allowable. Contract or consultant services that are directly related to ICAP. Really here we're kind of thinking about fees for speakers. Any sort of other program costs. Some ideas could be office space, member housing, those sorts of things. And then if there's any sort of media that might be generated that promotes the program or your project there locally, that could certainly be used as a source of match. But it really, again, has to be tied to the AmeriCorps members and what the program is actually benefiting from. Reasonable costs, again, has to kind of pass that prudent person test to make sure that nobody is paying extra for what they're receiving. And then obviously documenting it has to be submitted after the purchase or cost has been allocated. So we ran into the issues with this related to member benefits in terms of housing or personnel time. So you can't submit personnel timesheets 2 months in advance. You have to submit it after that month. So for the month of August, if you're submitting personnel timesheets for the month of August, you have to submit those in September or on the 31st of August. You can't submit those on the 1st of August. In the area of personnel or benefits, if you are submitting personnel time as a source of match for this program, chances are I've already reached out to you, but about these steps. But just to kind of cover them pretty quickly, we do need to complete background checks on that individual before we can count any time. That's an AmeriCorps requirement that's written to the statute for anybody who's benefiting or on a budget for this program. We do have to have an annual certification of salary. We have a template that you can use that your HR department can fill out. And then you as an individual, or whatever individual is doing that supervising, has to complete monthly timesheets. I have a template that we ask you to use that helps to document everything that's on there. The big things on there are that it has to be for the person's total activities, so the time for ICAP as well as the time for everything else. So you'll see on there there's 2 columns, one for ICAP, then one for other. It has to be signed and dated by the host site supervisor and the direct supervisor for each month. It has to represent the actual time spent on the ICAP grant, not an estimate. So you have to have a pretty good idea that you spent 2 hours supervising someone that day. And we ask that you submit them within the first 5 working days of the month. Last year, Volunteer Iowa gave us some additional guidance on what is an allowable personnel time for the program. And really what they told us is that supervisors should track only the hours when they're directly supervising the members, such as providing oversight, training, or guiding the members. And they estimate that number to be about 5 to 10% of any supervisor's time. That time can vary though, depending upon, and especially within this program, we have some sites that have 1 member, we have some sites that have 20 members, so site supervisor time might vary significantly. In terms of background checks, what is done through that process, we need to do the sex offender check, and then the state of Iowa, and then the state of residence if you're not currently a resident of Iowa. So if you're from a border town and you're a resident of Nebraska or Illinois or another state, then we need to complete the background check in that state as well. And we do have forms available for that. For the annual certification of salary, this is what the template looks like. It just kind of walks you through and gives you all the things that need to go in there. If you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out. This is what the monthly timesheet form looks like. Again, I can't emphasize that both the ICAP and the other column have to be filled in. And then that rate of pay, or at least the total match amount, has to be listed at the bottom, so that way I can put it on our claim, so that way everybody understands what the value of that time was. And then we also have the employee signature and the supervisor signature, which has to be filled out. For supervisor travel, really this is whatever your institution might use to reimburse your travel is what we need in order to document the travel on our grant. For the supply purchases, I think what we would use is an in-kind form, or we can also use any itemized receipts that you might have. So if you're actually purchasing the thing, we can use the itemized receipt. We just need to understand the purpose of it. If it's something that you're not purchasing, but you just have that was donated to you, or was just kind of in your office and you're donating it to the program, then we would use an in-kind form and kind of work with you to fill that out. And the donation is just Iowa Campus Compact, or for the AmeriCorps program. And it's important just to think of it that way, is that it's a donation to our program, not necessarily to your institution or anything like that. So we do have an in-kind form that we can help you fill out. We'll certainly work with you to complete that. It's pretty simple. For contracts or consultants or speaker fees or anything like that, obviously we just need, again, that agreement and to understand what percentage or how that agreement and speaker fee is applicable to the program in some way. And again, we would use the in-kind form to document that. Any sorts of other costs like in-kind media or other sorts of things, we would also use the in-kind form. We can also just get a letter from your agency or another agency or someone like that documents that. We're happy to help you out with that process as well. And then lastly, the deadlines. We ask that you submit, so if you're asking for reimbursement, to submit that documentation kind of as it occurs, so collect it and send it in to us just like you would to your business office. We do need to get that in relatively quickly within our own grant time. So we're asking for a final deadline around 9/15 of 19. So if you have costs that are occurring in December and you kind of forget about it for a little while, you have until September to turn those in. So that way we can make sure that we reimburse your costs. Kind of if it gets after that, then we can't. It's harder for us to go back and to apply them to the grant, and our funder might not be as willing to work with us on those things. So it's important to request the documentation or to request reimbursement as it kind of occurs as quickly as possible. In terms of resources that are available, you can look to the ICAP website. There's also the CFR for the big kind of overview of the federal policies and statutes. Certainly there are CNCS training resources that you can look at as well. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly. There's my email and my phone number. You can also contact Ryan and work with Ryan to answer any questions that you might have. So thank you for your time today and have a good rest of the day.